and welcome to another show of historical fiction author chats. And I'm really excited to introduce to you someone who I have never met before today, but I'm very happy that I did, Lecia Cornwall. And she is a Canadian author. I'll read you all her bio in a second. We'll get to that. But she's a Canadian author who is just putting out her first historical fiction book rather than historical romance book. And it's getting great talk in the US. But she's Canadian, so we need to talk about her here, and we need to get this book in everybody's hands. So hello, Lecia. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Genevieve. It's lovely to be here.
So Lecia Cornwall lives in Alberta, Canada, at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains with 5 cats, a chocolate lab named Andy, a rescued rabbit, 2 adult children, and a very patient husband, which all authors really do need. When she's not writing, Lecia can be found in the garden, or reading or volunteering at a local museum. Author of more than 15 historical romances, The Woman at the Front is her first historical fiction title, which is pretty cool because historical romance and historical fiction are both sort of subgenres, and we don't really, we don't usually overlap, but it's cool that you're doing this. So I'm very excited for you. So the synopsis of The Woman, and I should also say, Lecia knows this. The reason that we met is because Lecia has the support of such amazing Canadian authors as Jamie Chang and Jennifer Robson, who reached out to me and said, you've got to read this book. So thank you to those ladies, who we all know from this page. All right, this is for The Woman at the Front. A daring young woman risks everything to pursue a career as a doctor on the front lines in France during World War I and learns the true meaning of hope, love, and resilience in the darkest of times. When Eleanor Atherton graduates from medical school near the top of her class in 1917, she dreams of going overseas to help the wounded, but her ambition is thwarted at every turn. Eleanor's parents insist she must give up medicine, marry a respectable man, and assume her proper place. While women might serve as ambulance drivers or nurses at the front, they cannot be physicians. That work is considered too dangerous and frightening. Nevertheless, Eleanor is determined to make more of a contribution than sitting at home knitting for the troops. When an unexpected twist of fate sends Eleanor to the battlefields of France as the private doctor of a British peer, she seizes the opportunity for what it is, the chance to finally prove herself. But there is a war on, and a casualty clearing station close to the front lines is an unforgiving place. Facing skeptical commanders who question her skills, scores of wounded men needing care, underhanded efforts by her family to bring her back home, and a blossoming romance, Eleanor must decide if she's brave enough to break the rules, face her darkest fears, and take the chance to win the career and the love she's always wanted. I'm excited to read this. I am.
Oh, thank you.
So
I hope you enjoy it.
I will. I know I will. And now I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to turn the camera over to you. So everybody, here is Lecia Cornwall.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here today, and I want to read you the first chapter of the book about the start of Eleanor's adventure. There's The Woman at the Front, and please forgive me. I haven't read this out loud. It's always playing in my head, but as authors don't read their books very often. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, War Office, London, January 20th, 1918. Young woman, my advice to you is to go home, sit down, and take up something more useful, such as knitting. If I'd known E. Atherton was female, I would not have taken this appointment at all. That was precisely why Eleanor Atherton had used the initial instead of her full name. A trick, yes, but she'd already written hundreds of letters, made dozens of attempts to see bureaucrats and official representatives in person, and Miss Atherton had been refused every time. Not this time. Finally, she was sitting before someone who would be forced to listen. The very fact that she was here proved that it was not her credentials as a doctor that were lacking. E. Atherton was a highly qualified doctor indeed, and had been eagerly invited to this interview. She regarded the man's haughty, irritated, uncomfortable expression. She knew that, as a rule, female doctors weren't wanted by the military, the War Office, or even the Red Cross, no matter how competent or willing they might be. But the war had dragged on for almost 4 years, with hundreds of casualties, including doctors. She was certain that if she could just find a way to present herself in person, have the opportunity to speak to someone in a position of authority, then the exception would most certainly be made. Sir William Foxley was the undersecretary to another undersecretary to an assistant director of the War Office. He peered at her over her spectacles with a sharp frown. Her letter of application for overseas medical service sat between them on the polished surface of the mahogany table like a fallen flag. A thick silence followed Sir William's outburst, and he waited, expected, no doubt, for her to rise from her chair and scurry away, suitably chastened. Even the clock in the corner brisked disapproval, but Eleanor stayed where she was. The oak-panelled office smelled of lemon polish and Sir William's hair pomade, of paper and leather and tobacco, a thoroughly male preserve. There was a vase of flowers in the corner, a pallid bouquet of winter hothouse roses, but they did little to perfume the air or even add color to the airless room. But then there was a war on, and it had been endless and dreadful, and all the color, save for black and khaki and gray, had long been sucked out of the world. For a brief moment, pinned under Sir William's scornful gaze, Eleanor's starchy determination wilted a little, and a trickle of sweat rolled down her spine beneath her prim navy blue suit. But only for a moment. She was here now, and she'd been trying far too hard for far too long to give in. She'd waited weeks for this appointment, and she simply didn't have time to be cowed by his rudeness or his annoyance at having to deal with an unexpected and unwelcome female doctor. I understand that doctors are badly needed in France. I've read of the terrible casualties at Passchendaele and Ypres, just weeks ago at Cambrai. I've seen those men coming home maimed and bandaged. There has been a general call for qualified doctors. Sir William's chin jerked. For male doctors, yes, of course, but not women. What would your husband say? I'm not married. Sir William scanned her face and figure appraisingly, gauging her age and potential marriageability. Your father, then, surely he would not want to see you in a war zone, at the front, under fire, dealing with... He rolled the air with his hand as he sought the right words. Well, with unspeakable things. Eleanor lifted her chin. My father is also a doctor. He served in the South African War. He has seen all the unspeakable things war leaves in its wake. I grew up on those stories. Sir William looked more closely at the letter before him. Sir John Atherton, Dr. John Atherton, he said in surprise. Why, I know him. We are members of the same gentlemen's club in York. Eleanor allowed herself to smile, hopeful now that a connection had been made, things would improve. Instead, Sir William removed his glasses altogether and frowned even harder. I've known Dr. Atherton for many years. He has never mentioned the fact that he has a daughter or that doctor. He's spoken of son. My twin brother, Edward. He's currently serving in France at headquarters. Does your father know you are here, applying for a medical posting in France? Surely he knows that neither the War Office nor the British Red Cross permits women to serve there. Eleanor dug her fingernails into her palms. No, her father most definitely had not given her permission to be here. Eleanor felt a twinge of guilt. She told her parents she was taking tea with a friend in York today. Female nurses are allowed to serve at the front, she countered. VADs are encouraged to go to France. And there are female ambulance drivers and clerks and... He held up his hand. They are not doctors. Doctors have specific duties that no woman could undertake. War is not a society picnic or a holiday jaunt, Miss Atherton. Soldiers are rough and crude, mannerless at times. It is to be expected in war. He shifted, his lined face pinkening. Men have needs. Battle brings out certain animal passions. A medical doctor is required to monitor the most unsavory of ailments. No lady would wish to be exposed to such things. He looked at her pointedly, and she held his gaze boldly, unfazed. Medical officers must oversee sanitation and hygiene, and they must go into the frontline trenches to do so, working under fire where the danger is highest. A great number of good doctors have been killed that way. We do not allow women of any stripe there, and the medical posts and casualty clearing stations take the wounded straight from the battlefield, horribly injured, dirty, and in pain. It is not the clean, sanitary, clinical environment you no doubt saw at medical school. He referred to her letter again. At the University of Edinburgh. He read further, underlining the details with the manicured finger. I see you graduated 7th in your class. All women, I assume? There were 6 women at the beginning and only 2 at graduation, but Sir William raised his finger from the page to stab it in her direction like a bayonet. There, you see? It goes to prove that women are unable to endure the stresses and challenges of the medical career. Their withdrawal had more to do with being taunted and bullied mercilessly by their fellow students and even the professors, Eleanor said. But it also means I graduated 7th in a class of more than 130 men. His triumphant smirk pulled into a tight pinch. He pushed her letter aside, folded his hands together, and leaned forward. May I ask how old you are, Miss Atherton? I'm 23, she said. My date of birth is included in my application. He didn't bother to look. He kept his eyes fixed on her. 23. And a virgin, I assume, if you are unmarried? Eleanor was taken aback by the intimate question, and he sat back. You blush. How do you imagine you'll handle the rigors of battle, the sight of male bodies undressed, the sound of men cursing? It would be in a medical context, a wounded person, not... Her blush deepened, and her tongue tied itself in a knot, but not out of shyness. It was pure molten desire, not for naked men, but for medicine, and the raw need to serve, the frustration of not being allowed to use her education and skills to help those men. She held his eyes. I would not shirk, Sir William, she said, and knew that that was inadequate. He shifted his chair. You think you would not, but one never knows until one is tried in battle. There is your future to think of, and the feelings of your father and mother in this matter. As of this moment, there is nothing to prevent you from forgetting this nonsense and seeing sense. My advice is to return home, find a suitable place, find a suitable husband, and take your proper place as wife and mother. Britain needs strong families as badly as we need fighting men and frontline doctors, male doctors. He glanced up at the gilt-framed portrait of King George V that hung over the fireplace. You would still be doing something vitally important. What are my other options, she asked, ignoring the patriotic speech. For practicing medicine, I mean. Helping the wounded. Confound it, Miss Atherton, can you not knit? I prefer embroidery, actually, she said. It has helped me perfect my suturing. For an instant, his brows rose in surprise. Then he shut his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he looked up at last, his gaze was both baffled and resigned. The suffering look of a man faced with a vexing problem of a willful child or a difficult woman. If you are so upon this course, I suggest you consider practicing in one of the hospitals here at home that care for women and children. He tried smiling at her, a fond uncle soothing an unruly niece, performing an uncomfortable but unnecessary role, providing a gentle correction. That would be most suitable. Something more genteel, a role to keep you busy until you're married, eh? Is there anything else, anywhere else I might apply? The avuncular look faded. There are hospitals run by women in France, but not in our jurisdiction. They are under the auspices of the French Red Cross. He sniffed with disdain. There's also a convalescent hospital in London staffed by women, and there are female doctors treating refugees in Serbia, but they do not have official support, and there is rampant disease and contagion there. Those women serve at their own risk and expense, and the understanding that they cannot expect official aid from the king's government. Eleanor sat forward hopefully. Would they? He thumped his fist on the table. Young woman, as your father's friend, I beg you to go home and stop this nonsense. This is not the kind of life for a well-bred woman. She refused to wilt under his icy glare. She held his gaze boldly until he was the one to sigh and look away. Do you truly wish to embarrass your parents? I hope to make them proud of me. She remembered how her mother had cried at the graduation ceremony, sure her daughter had ruined her future with an advanced education and a medical degree. In the 8 months since that day, she hadn't stopped looking at Eleanor with a mixture of bafflement and disappointment. It was much like Sir William's pained expression now. Her father had been an army doctor once, and she'd hoped that he would understand why she wanted this. why she felt called to serve. I dare say your father would like to continue his career and eventually retire without anything marring his reputation in the community, both the medical one and the social one, Sir William said. What you do next will reflect upon him, Miss Atherton, and upon your future husband. A good man would think twice about proposing to a woman of such experience. He pushed her letter across the desk with the tip of one finger and rose from his chair. He took out his watch and glanced at it pointedly. The interview was over. There was nothing to do but pick up the letter, fold it, and put it in her pocketbook. Frustration rose, and Eleanor swallowed, tasting bitterness on her tongue. If Sir William knew how far she'd come, all she'd done to become a doctor, he'd not doubt her determination. She lifted her eyes to Sir William, a renewed plea on her lips. But he'd already turned away, was crossing the room to open the door for her. She followed, her spine stiff, her expression placid. As she'd also learned that at medical school, not to let disappointment or frustration show, no matter how those emotions raged in her breast. It was weakness, and it made one easy prey, a victim or a casualty. Find another way had become her motto, her creed. Go around the obstacles in her path. Find another way. Sir William paused with his hand on the latch. Have you considered the possibility of applying to serve as a nurse or a member of the voluntary aid detachment? He asked. Much more ladylike pursuits. Eleanor's simmering frustration came to a boil. She clenched the handle of her pocketbook so tightly that she heard the bamboo crack. A foul curse word, also learned at medical school, rose to the tip of her tongue. She clamped it behind her teeth just in time. Instead, she raised her chin and looked along the length of her nose at the bureaucrat. She was taller by half a head, and he noted that, colored, and subtly rose on his toes. I am not a nurse, Sir William, or a volunteer. She leaned forward, her nose inches from his, her eyes narrowed. I am a doctor. And that's the end of chapter 1.
Very nice. Very nice. And I've been working on a book right now that's set in World War I, but it's with nurses. And it's amazing how they, like the nurses handled unthinkable things as well. But apparently that was okay, just not the doctors. Crazy.
Yes. It
was. Yeah. So this is your 15th or 16th book, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Everything you've been doing up until now has been historical romance rather than historical fiction. And it's mostly been set in, well, not mostly. I saw you had a mixture, but Highlanders and set much earlier. So this is a big turn for you. What got you going in historical fiction and then in World War I and all that?
One of the historical fiction series, or the Scottish series, was a multi-book contract, and the contract was sort of canceled in the middle for poor sales and not enough readership. And I spoke to my agent and I said, well, what do I do now? And she said, well, you've been talking about doing this book about World War I, and I think that's more in keeping with the direction you want to go, doing something a little bit more sophisticated and a little different, and sort of stepping out of romance and into historical fiction. She said, this is the time for you to do that. Now go away and do it, and we'll see what happens. And that's exactly what I did. So it's amazing. I sometimes find that she knows me better than I know myself, and her advice has always been excellent. So
that is very helpful. So, but for both, you would have had to do a lot of research. Historical romance may be considered lighter, but it's still full of accurate information and research that you had to do. So this also, that would have been a big change for you. What was it like getting into historical fiction research instead of romance?
Well, for any time period I write in, I read everything I can about the social structure and the events of the time, the clothes, the food, the speech affectations, everything. And that was no different for World War One. I started with reading about the medical history and the battles and everything else that was going on at the time, social expectation for women. A lot about the medical services and the limitations and advancements that they found at that point. So yeah, it was a lot of reading, and I loved it. I mean, it was wonderful.
It is. I love the research part of it almost as much as I don't know, maybe the same as I love the creativity part of it. It's such a blend. And so this part of World War One history, and in particular concentrating in the medical field and all that, where did you get that interest? Where was that specific idea? When did that get seeded?
Well, I've always loved medical history. I have an absolute fascination with it. But the actual idea for the story, when I was about 15, my grandfather was an immigrant from Britain to Canada, and he and his brother both served in World War One, and they both fought at Vimy Ridge, which is a famous Canadian battle. And my grandfather was behind the lines with the artillery, and his brother was up at the very front, and he was killed very early on in the battle. And my grandfather, when I was about 15, he said, well, he told me the story, and he said, I want you to go over and see the war grave when you can. And I finally did with my kids when I was about, when they were about, I think my son was just about to turn 18. And we searched all over the area, and we finally found this tiny little war cemetery in you could sort of see the monument over the trees. And it was just such a moving moment. And I thought, yeah, I really want to write about his war. But when I started doing the research, I thought, well, I'll do it from a female perspective. And that figured, okay, that means writing about a nurse. But when I started doing the research, I found out female doctors weren't allowed over there on the front by the British. I thought, no, that's a much better story. That's a much more daring, sort of adventurous story for this female character. So that's why that became what it is.
Oh, that gives me chills that you did it based on his story. That's beautiful. Wouldn't it be great to know what he would think of your book if he could read it now? I think that often.
Yes. Well, you know what relatives are like. I mean, my father used to say, well, what do you do? Well, I write. Well, what do you mean you write? Do you use a typewriter? Well, yes, I use a computer. Oh, then you're a secretary. And I have a feeling my grandfather probably would have thought the same. But yeah, it's funny how other generations sort of view you differently, and your family views what you write as something, differently than other people do. So
very true, very true. So did you enjoy this whole process, this different style of writing?
Very much, very much. I find it historical fiction, romance has an awful lot of genre adventure. You have to have a couple, they have to fall in love, and they have to end up together more or less on a permanent basis at the end of the story. This sort of gives you much more the chance to follow the woman's story, and she's an independent person. And yes, there's a romance in the story. I mean, my publisher said, you have a background in romance, we want to make use of that. So add a love interest, which was a lot of fun. But it is essentially her story. And
I find that
was wonderful.
Yeah, well, when you're writing historical fiction, not everyone does it. I always include a love story in mine, just because I think when you're talking about history, to a lot of people, history is pretty black and white. But when you add the colors of a love story and relationship and how the people get along that way, it's I don't know, it makes the history more impactful. It helps you remember more. So I'm glad. I'm looking forward to that part of your story as well. Your next book, we always have people think that when you're a writer, you just write a book and then you're done. But in my experience, like right now I'm working on about 3 books at the same time. So it's always kind of going. And our friend Kate Quinn, she's always publishing something. And so it just keeps going. So I imagine you are working on something as well.
Yes, I just turned in the second book in the contract I'm working on, and this one required a lot of research as well. It's set between the war in 1936 in Berlin during the Olympic Games, and that was sort of set off by reading something about the fact that the British sent their debutantes over to Germany between the wars for a bit of finishing and international polish, and in hopes of finding a husband as well, because I think a lot of them believed that if there was a connection, a marital connection between the two countries, there couldn't possibly be another war. But of course, while Hitler was celebrating this great peaceful game, spectacle of athleticism, behind the scenes, he was already planning for war. So the heroine of this story is approached by someone that she knows, a British journalist, who says, okay, you're the guest of a high-ranking family. You can go pretty much anywhere and you can take pictures. Can you find out evidence that we can take home of what's really going on behind the scenes? And of course, there's a lot of danger and suspense. There's more suspense in this story than I've ever written. Oh. So that was a challenge.
Yeah, it is. I know what you're saying. That's exciting. Well, good for you. I'm happy for you, and I'm happy you found. I have not strayed beyond this genre, so I admire you for taking that plunge and going in that new direction. Thank you so much for being on here. I want to tell everybody else who's watching here that the book comes out here in Canada September 28th. And if you're watching this page, there will be a contest coming up as well, which I don't always get to do, but with a few terrific authors and friends of ours. And I'll be sharing it on this page as well. That's the first week of October. But thank you again very much for being here. And I look forward to reading your book.
Well, it was lovely being here and spending some time with your readers and listeners. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you again soon. Take care.